Hey, hey, welcome back to Young Heretics, the last best hope of the West. This is where we bring you Western culture without all of the other crap that is raging outside, without all the identity politics and all that nonsense. And today we are focusing on Aeschylus, the Greek tragedian Aeschylus, and his play, The Persians. This is the earliest extant European drama. It's the earliest drama from Europe that comes down to us. It's a fantastic play, tremendously rich. I actually got the idea to do this episode because I was on John Miller's show over at National Review. He has a show called The Great Books Podcast, and we did an episode on Persians, which I thought came out really well. It's not out yet, but when it's out, I'll let you know. You should totally go and listen to it. But it was another one of those things where we were talking about this play, and I just thought there's so much here. We can do a Young Heretics deep dive. And then I went to sort of make my notes for that deep dive, and I was like, actually, there's more here than just one episode. There's just so much here. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do a series of episodes. And it's not going to be, don't worry, we're not going to do Persians every week for the next 12 weeks. But I'm going to come back to this play kind of again and again and just return time after time and emphasize different themes each time. It's kind of like holding the thing up to the light in different ways. And eventually we can release the whole thing as just one big, giant smorgasbord. But each episode will kind of visit a different theme, because I just think that this play is so profound and so deep. And there's also a lot that we have to talk about to kind of get into tragedy and what tragedy is. And in fact, I think it was last week that I finished up by talking about the tragic mindset, right? I was noting that we kind of don't understand the tragic mindset as much as we should, the truly tragic mindset in America and in modernity. We don't get that for the Greeks, a huge portion of the world was just understanding that there are some inescapable sorrows. There are some sorrows that you just have to sit with and gain wisdom from rather than canceling them out. And so that is why another reason why I thought it would be good to kind of go back to this first tragedy that we have. It's not the first Greek tragedy that was ever composed or performed. We're going to get to that. But in some ways, I think it's providence that this is the earliest Greek tragedy that we have, because what I'm going to focus on today is that this play deals with something profoundly deep in the DNA of the West. And that is the interest in empathizing with conquered peoples. And this is something you kind of, one of the big criticisms of the West right now is that it's just jingoistic and evil and just conquers all this stuff. But nothing could be further from the truth. So Persians is a good way to kind of get into exploring how it is and why it is that part of the Western tradition is thinking your way into the minds even of your enemies, even after you beat somebody in war. A big part of the Western tradition is sort of thinking your way into what it must have been like to be conquered and understanding being conquered and deriving wisdom for that for the times when you will yourself be, downtrodden or suffering. So that's, to me, one of the great contributions of Persians to the ongoing tradition. And it's fitting that it's the first tragedy that we have, because that tragic outlook, that way of looking at the world that says, pain and sorrow comes for us all. And so it behooves us, even when we're on top, it behooves us to think about what it must be like for the people that are on the bottom. That fundamentally Western impulse is also at the fundamental heart of tragedy. So that's why we're dealing in many ways today with Persians. And that's what we're going to focus on. But before we get to the meat of the play, let's just do a little bit of background on how tragedy comes into being, what it is, why we care about it, why it exists. Because not everybody, I think, will sort of know that when we say the word tragedy today, typically what we mean is, well, something that's very sad. This thing was very sad, and so we call it a tragedy. It was tragic. But of course, that doesn't even get at the beginning of what people have understood by the word. And if we go way, way back to the origins, what we're really dealing with here is a specific Athenian cultural and artistic institution. We're dealing with, in many ways, the jewel of Athenian artistic culture. And the Athenians back in the High Classical period in the 5th century BC understood this in many ways to be one of their central cultural contributions to the world. So it all takes place in this festival called the City Dionysia. And you may have heard of this, maybe not. It happens every year in March. It's a big festival. And it goes back further than we can really know. There are roots to the city Dionysia that don't get recorded in history. And eventually, not in this episode, but eventually we'll talk a little bit more about that history and about the history of kind of analyzing this tragic tradition. But what we do know is that around in the 530s, 534, 531 BC, there is a tyrant in Athens. Athens, of course, is famous for its democracy, but it had periods also of autocracy and tyranny. And it was ruled at one point by a tyrant named Pisistratus. And he set about to revitalize the city Dionysia. There were a lot of kind of city kings, little petty kings in this area in this time. And one of the ways that they distinguished themselves was by making their city the place where the place where it all happened. And there were various different ways to do that. But one way was to throw a big festival, a big party. And this city Dionysia, which had existed in Athens since before Pisistratus, was his way of kind of making Athens into the place to be. And it kind of worked. I mean, in a lot of ways, Athens did eventually become renowned for the tragedies that were put on in the city Dionysia. But going back to the origins of it, fundamentally what this is it's a yearly festival in honor of the god Dionysus. And there is always at every city Dionysia a Pompeii, which is a Greek word for a procession or a parade, where you take the statue of Dionysus from outside the city limits and you bring him in to the theater of Dionysus, which is carved into the hillside near the Acropolis, which is this kind of city center, this civic and religious center on the top of a hill in Athens. There's a theater that is notched into that hillside, and that is where you bring the statue of the god Dionysus to begin this great festival. Now, why do we care about Dionysus? Who is Dionysus? If you don't know that much about Greek myth and legend, probably the first thing you think when I say Dionysus is you think like the fat guy who drinks a lot of wine. He's really funny. He gets drunk all the time. That is not the kind of thing that we are dealing with here at all. Dionysus is not a big funny fat guy. In the highest artistic tradition and mythological tradition of Athens, Dionysus is actually a very weird and sexy young man, or even a boy. He's sort of this strange, sylph-like figure who comes wafting in, usually from the east, in many cases from Lydia, which is an area in what is now Turkey and Asia Minor. So he comes in and he's sort of this force of havoc. If you really want to get into what Dionysus is like, go away and read Euripides' Bacchae, or it's sometimes called Bacchae. And we'll do episodes on the Bacchae and on Euripides. But if you just want a quick sort of update on it now, go away and read Bacchae, where he's portrayed, Dionysus comes into the Greek-speaking city of Thebes, and he's portrayed as this sort of terrifyingly beautiful young boy with beautiful eyes. He's almost beautiful in the way that a woman is, but at the same time, he drives women crazy with sort of lust and frenzy. He's this force of a tremendously unsettling force of chaos. And this is important. Why is it important? It's important because this is not just a kind of, little fairy tale that people have about this god Dionysus. This is a way for the Athenians to acknowledge something incredibly human. And that is this. Athens had this wonderful civilization that was developing this culture, tremendous pride in its laws and in its way of doing things, its distinctive way, democratic way of doing things. And they loved their systems and they loved their philosophy, as we have talked about. They believed in what you might call law and order. But they also acknowledged, and they had ways of publicly acknowledging, that no system is big enough to contain the human spirit, and that there are wild elements to the human soul. And if you don't acknowledge those wild elements, if you don't kind of make some kind of reference to them in your traditions and your understanding of yourself, then they will tear you apart from the inside out. And that, in many ways, that's what Bacchae is actually about, that play. But bringing Dionysus, bringing this force of strangeness, of outsiderness, of easternness and chaos into the city is a way of understanding and incorporating all of that. Once a year, eventually Aristotle, when he talked about tragedy, would say that a big part of its effect is catharsis, this purification, this way of kind of engaging with the chaos so that it doesn't destroy you. And that's what the city Dionysia is about. And so Dionysus is the god of wine. He's also the god of frenzy. He presides over this theatrical festival. And there's lots of different ways to honor him. And that's what the Dionysia is all about. There's all sorts of different ways to honor him. One fundamentally important way to honor him is with what's called a dithyramb. And that's a choral song that was sung and danced, and you would have accompaniment on the aulos, which is this kind of the auloi, or the double pipe instruments. You have two pipes playing this very kind of passionate and powerful way of celebrating Dionysus with poetry and song and music. And you have the tragic competitions, which are also held in honor of him and in honor of Dionysus. And it's three tragic poets who get to compete. And each one writes a trilogy of tragedies. So 3 tragedies followed by a satyr play. Now, the satyrs were these sort of half goat, half men. They were these weird figures that sort of followed Dionysus around, and they too had this tremendous sexual drive, this tremendous energy. They're kind of this weird force of like animal human nature. And so again, you have this idea that, humanity is coming up against the edges of itself and meeting with the animal part of its nature, so that this doesn't just destroy us year round, but we sort of encounter it now. And so the satyr play is acted by satyrs, by actors actually with huge comic erections. Again, trying not to get like too ridiculously graphic, just for the sake of of listeners, but this is a very, very sexually graphic kind of coda to the tragic trilogy. So you have 3 tragedies, and then a satyr play, which is maybe a spoof of a mythological story. It might even be a spoof of one of the stories that's already been in the tragedy, or it deals with something else entirely. But it's kind of this, this raucous comedy as almost like an aftertaste to this deep trilogy of sorrowful plays. So they're sometimes called tetralogies for plays, because the satyr play is included. And you get 3 different tetralogies, each written by a different author, and eventually one of them wins. And the person that wins gets tremendous honor. We actually when we talked about the symposium, you might remember that we talked about the fact that Agathon, who is the guest of honor at the symposium described by Plato, Agathon has just won his first tragic competition at the city Dionysia. This comes with prizes, it comes with honor, and it comes in some tellings, it originally came with a goat. And just a brief kind of side note about why that's funny and interesting. So it's the kind of legend, it's unclear how true this is. We don't know whether this is accurate, but it's told to us that Thespis, who is this sort of semi-legendary guy that was kind of the great originator of acting in Athens, Thespis won a goat at the tragic competitions. And in Greek, the word tragoidia kind of sounds like it might mean goat song. That's the Greek word that is potentially referring back to this goat that you got as a prize. And now this is sort of folklore. It's unclear whether it's exactly true. And in general, we're going to talk about the fact that we don't totally know what is and isn't true about the origins of tragedy. But it's a nice little story. And what we do know is that, you have these 3 guys competing, and it's a tremendous honor to win the tragic competitions at the city Dionysia. And so that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about, it's like the Super Bowl plus Easter Sunday plus 4th of July, right? This civic, religious, artistic gathering where we all get together and we have an experience that unites all the Athenians and their, and eventually their guests as well would have this experience that kind of unites them behind a whole vision of the world, an entire way of looking at the world through art and through tragedy. Now, Persians, which is the play that we are talking about today, was the winner. It was part of a trilogy that won the tragic competitions in 472 BC. So in the tragic competitions of 472, Aeschylus wins with the trilogy that contains Persians. Now, as I mentioned, this is not the first tragedy that was ever produced, not by a long shot, but it's the first tragedy that we have. And in fact, unfortunately, if you don't know this already, I'm sorry to be the one that is breaking this news. There is this enormous iceberg of sources and texts and art from the ancient world that is lost. It's hard to even reckon with how much we've lost. And as I talk about it, I keep I'm about to say it's a tragedy. It's not exactly a tragedy in the sense that we're talking about, but it is very, very sad to contemplate the fact that Aeschylus himself composed 90 tragedies. We have 7. We have 7 of them. So basically 7.7% of Aeschylus' tragedies survive. If we had 7% of Shakespeare's plays, we'd have 3 plays. So that's what we're dealing with. And it's important. One of the reasons it's important to remember that is if you were just thinking about Shakespeare by reading 3 of his plays, you would probably think that you knew a lot more than you actually did about Shakespearean style. So everything that we claim, oh, Aeschylus is like this. It's like, well, the 7 plays that we have are like that. And he had certain reputation in antiquity. But there may have been even more to these artists, which is amazing when you think about it. There may have been even more to these artists than we know about or than we recall. But we do at least, we get these few glimpses into what was an enormous civilization with all sorts of artistic production. In this case, what we have is there were certain tragedies that were taught in schools. And so in the medieval manuscript tradition, as they start to kind of keep writing these plays down, before there's computers and all this stuff, you have to write manuscripts down by hand. And in the manuscript tradition, Persians is preserved as part of a kind of a school curriculum. And so we still have it, which is a big relief, in fact. And it's part of a trilogy which we don't have, sadly. So there were 2 other plays. Persians seems to have been the middle play. But before that, there was Phineas and there was Glaukos Potniaeus. And then the satyr play associated with it was called Prometheus. And that's basically the majority of what we know, because what we have is these things called hypotheses, which came at the beginning of these manuscripts, probably attached during the Hellenistic period when there was this great flourishing of scholarship in Alexandria, the famous library of Alexandria, right? The scribes were gathering up all of these manuscripts or these texts, and they were writing down, here's kind of the basic story. So you have a summary of the story of Persians, and then the hypothesis tells us also that there were these 2 other plays and this satyr play involved. It seems like, and this is also kind of interesting, it seems like those plays weren't related to Persians in terms of narrative. So it was not just one big story. Most trilogies, so far as we know, were all told kind of one big, long, continuous story. That's not the case. Persians stands alone, which is nice because we only have Persians, so we can kind of experience it as its one sort of thing unto itself. But so here's Persians, which we know, which we do have. And it's a one-off, and it's intriguing because it's a historical play. Now, that may not seem particularly odd, but it was very, very rare for the Greeks to compose tragedies about actual events from history. That was not something. Usually, tragedies were about myth and legend. And Aristotle, who, again, we will deal in more detail with Aristotle's theory of tragedy later on in another episode, but Aristotle does say at one point, he kind of thinks that poetry is more philosophical than history, because when you write poems, when you write tragedy, you can deal with myths, which are kind of like the idealized and the sort of hypothetical way that the world could be, rather than the sort of accidents of things that tend to happen, just sort of randomly in history. You don't have to deal with that in tragedy. You can deal with the mythological version of the way the world is. And we talked about this when we dealt with C.S. Lewis, that there is truth in that as well, right? That part of what art does is it gets at truths that mere history can't get at by telling you these kind of mythological, larger than life stories. And so many tragedies are like that. And it was not without risk to compose a historical tragedy. So there had been historical tragedies before Persians. We know that, for example, Phrynichus, who was another tragedian, wrote a tragedy about the sack of Miletus, which is an event that we will get to actually down the line in this episode. But the sack of Miletus was a very sad event in Athenian history. And it was so sad that when the Athenians watched Phrynichus play, they fined him for reminding him of this terrible dark day in their history. So it was not without risk to create a historical tragedy. So why does Aeschylus do it? Well, I can think of one reason that I think is probably important. The Persian Wars, which are the conflicts that this tragedy is about, were a series of events in history, in actual history, that for the Athenians and for the Greeks more generally were important enough to be like a myth. They had the character of myth. They had these big and tremendously consequential events that transformed the course of history. So I suspect that one reason why this play works as a tragedy, even though tragedy is usually about myth, is that for the Athenians, the Persian Wars are part of their own lived myth. It's part of the just way that history has been larger than life for them. Eventually, we're going to get to doing Herodotus. who is in some ways the father of history, he's often called, right? And Herodotus is a good example of somebody who does not do history in the way that we now do history. We think of history as just the facts, Jack, But Herodotus includes, in his account, all of these myths and legends as part of his way of bringing the color to the events that occurred. And so in the ancient world, before some of the later developments, before people like Thucydides, whom we'll also cover, before those people, there was this kind of slightly blurrier line between history and legend. And whereas a lot of the time you would kind of treat myth as part of history, not as if, it necessarily happened exactly, but as if it contained truths about people's experience in the past, which I think is a wise way to go about things. This is the opposite. This is the version where Aeschylus is kind of treating history as a part of the mythological and legendary past. It has that heightened emotion and that heightened consequence, but it actually happened. So that's one of the reasons why this is, in fact, a really great play. It's also a reason why we need to take some time and talk about what exactly is the history behind this play. And here is an interesting moment for us on Young Heretics, because this is a podcast about the West. I have already kind of defined the West generally as the cultural products and heritage of Athens and Jerusalem. So this is kind of two pillars of Western civilization that we are now all heirs to. But we haven't talked that much about the East, which is also something that, even in the ancient world is tremendously important, is to understand yourself in contrast to other people who do things differently. And now we get into this whole kind of thing about, is the West fundamentally racist, right? Is the West fundamentally about just, stereotyping the East and thinking about the East as this, other evil person? I am going to argue throughout this episode that is exactly the opposite of what is true. Aeschylus and the people like him in antiquity who were interested in what we've come to call the Near East, the sort of Eastern empires with which Greece came into conflict, are not interested in people like the Persians just because they want to figure out why they're so awful and to, pump up the Greek. Yay, go Greeks, ooh, boo Persians. That is not what we're dealing with here. What we are dealing with, and what Aeschylus was dealing with, was questions about human nature. If human beings are fundamentally human beings, why is it that some empires rise and some empires fall? What is it that makes certain cultures successful? And how do we do things differently? How are our ideas different in Greece than they are in Persia? Even if we kind of can respect Persia as a big noble civilization. And so it's not just about talking down the East. It's about understanding and thinking about the East. So we're going to take some time now and just talk about the history of the empires in what has come to be called the ancient Near East. So think about the geographical region kind of in and around what is now Iran, right? That's sort of what we're talking about. And we have actually encountered the empires of the ancient Near East once before on this podcast when we talked about Isaiah, because you may recall, if you haven't listened to that episode, go back and listen to it. But if you recall that episode, we dealt a lot with the Babylonian exile, which was when the Jewish people were exiled from Jerusalem. It was this terrible tragedy. Isaiah warned about it. It eventually happened. They were sent into exile in Babylon. And the Babylonians were one of the empires that kind of gained power in the Near East. The thing you have to understand about this region of the world in antiquity is that they had been forming enormous, powerful, and sophisticated civilizations long before Athens had its high classical period, long before any of this kind of, Greek stuff was going on. There were fascinating and incredibly sophisticated civilizations in the East. And so that is the first thing to kind of note here, is that in many ways, if you were to look at the ancient world before any of the big stuff happened, before any of the stuff that we now think of as kind of the Greek classical period, you would probably guess that the winners of the ancient world, as it were going to be the Persians or the Babylonians or somebody, because they were constantly, there were these empires, these rival empires that were battling with one another and amassing vast territories unto themselves. So the first one that we really encountered with Isaiah was what you would call the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And this, Assyria is one of the powers that has been sort of jockeying for dominance. And around 911 BC and sort of up through to sort of the late 600s BC, the Neo-Assyrian Empire kind of becomes the power, the dominant power in this region. one of the kings of the Neo-Assyrian Empire who was particularly ambitious was Tiglath-Pileser the Third. And Tiglath-Pileser the Third was important in Isaiah because he kind of started to encroach on the territory that was Israel, right? So it started to come close to Jerusalem. And there was, as you may remember, there was this big battle between kind of was King Ahaz, the king of the Jews, was he going to bend the knee to Assyria, or was he going to form an alliance against them? And eventually, catastrophically, he does bend the knee to Assyria. So he takes the Assyrian gods into the temple and all this terrible stuff that leads eventually to catastrophe. But why does it lead to catastrophe? We didn't really get into this because after that whole thing, and that's in the 700s BC, then in 612 BC, there's the Battle of Nineveh, Nineveh is the big Assyrian kind of almost like the capital city, and it falls to Nabopolassar, who is a Babylonian king. So this is another power, the Babylonians, and he's kind of gathered this allegiance of all these different groups, the Medes, who are important, we'll get to them in a bit, the Scythians, the residents of Susa, and Susa is actually where Persians is set, right? So Nabopolassar, conquers, and Nineveh falls, and now it's the Babylonians that turn, and the Babylonians are the ones who eventually lead the Jews into exile. So the catastrophe that Ahaz couldn't see coming was that he was making this alliance with an empire that was just going to get trampled underfoot by another great power, the Babylonians. So the Babylonians conquer the Jews. That takes us up to speed from our Isaiah episode, because the next thing that happens is that the Jews are liberated, and they are liberated by Cyrus the Great. Cyrus II, he's sometimes called Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus the Great is the first great Persian king of the Achaemenid lines, the Achaemenid Persians who destroy the Babylonian Empire, or who rather kind of rise up over it. And at that point, Babylon is under Nabonidus or Nabonidus, or however you want to say it, right? And so Babylon is Babylon's on the outs, Persia's in, and Cyrus, this Achaemenid conqueror, is actually kind of a hero in the Hebrew Bible, in Isaiah, because he liberates the Jews. He sends the Jews back home in 538 BC. So we're getting up to the period that is going to be important for the Greeks. And this is kind of, to me, one of the most exciting moments, and it's not very often discussed, that you have this tragic and terrible conflict between the Jews and the Babylonians, and then the camera kind of shifts over to Greece, to the other major pillar of the West, which we don't, they didn't know about this, at the time. They didn't know that this was what was going on exactly. But now we look back on this period, it's this incredible moment when both Athens and Jerusalem kind of are going to come up against the empires of the Near East. So what happens? Cyrus sends the Jews home, and he is, again, another one of these kind of big imperial figures, and he's a great conqueror. He leads Persia to greatness, and there is a dynastic line which we will deal with when we do Herodotus, because it's sort of fun and interesting in and of itself, of the Achaemenids. But we end up eventually down the line with Darius on the throne. So Darius is the Persian king. And he is, again, like Tiglath-Pileser, he's very ambitious, very interested in conquering as much as he possibly can. He wants to spread out his territory. And just as the spreading of the territory was dangerous to little Jerusalem, right, on the edges of those territories, it is also dangerous to Greece. When the Eastern empires start to expand, they start looking westward, they start thinking, oh, those Greeks, those Greek-speaking people. And at this point, we have to remember, right, that Greece is not like Greece, the great Greece that it is now in our minds. They're not unified. Unlike the Persian Empire and the empires of the Near East, they are not these kind of centralized autocratic imperial systems. And famously, many of them, Athens especially, is kind of dealing with experiments in self-government, experiments in democracy. And so they are not able, just constitutionally, to form the same kind of unified alliance that these great Persian kings are able to form, which means that if you're looking at this, you're sort of thinking, this is bad news bears for the Greeks, right? Because they, Athens and Sparta, even though they're very great in our imagination and in our recollection, at the time, they were not centralized. You would never have thought they would be able to resist the great empires of the East. And in fact, in addition to what is now mainland Greece, there were a number of Greek-speaking peoples kind of to the east of that in what's called Asia Minor, or Turkey now. And Ionia is this kind of region on the coast of Asia Minor, where there are these Greek-speaking peoples who are gradually conquered. It's called Medizing because they're conquered by the Medes or the Persians, you might call them. And these Medized Ionians are already, before Athens has to deal really with a Persian invasion, the Ionians are already there as kind of a symbol of what is potentially coming down the pike, is that you're going to have to bend the knee to Persia. And Athens has a series of kind of interactions with these Ionian Greeks, including a number of times when they sort of try to aid rebel uprisings. So the Ionians try to kind of claim back their own freedom from the Persians. And the Athenians are sort of interested from about 498 BC onward. They're trying maybe to send ships to help Ionia to rise up. And that is where eventually we get to the sack of Miletus, which you may recall just a moment ago I mentioned as the subject of Phrynichus's great tragedy, his historical tragedy, which made the Athenians so sad that they fined him, right? In 494, there is an uprising against Persia in Miletus, this Ionian kind of colony. And the Athenians try to help, and the Persians wipe them out. They just mop the floor with them. And so this is kind of like this warning shot of like, oh boy, we've been sort of nibbling around the edges of this empire, but this is a juggernaut. This is a power unlike anything that we've seen in Greece. We do not want to mess with these guys. It's blood chilling to kind of imagine this vast, sprawling empire, and its territory is just getting bigger and bigger. And the Greeks are kind of looking around, the Athenians are looking around thinking, we might be next. And sure enough, Darius, this big, ambitious monarch, he comes to the throne and he starts to think, how can I be greater than any of my forefathers? How can I stretch the territory out and add to the greatness of Persia? Well, one way is I can conquer these meddlesome Athenians and these Spartans, and I can kind of get my hands on mainland Greece. Now, this is the first of a series of pivotal moments for the Greeks. In 490 BC, Darius has been trying to make an invasion of Greece. The Greeks decide they're going to stand up to him. They're not going to bend the knee. They're going to preserve and stand by their way of doing things, which is a democratic way of doing things. They're going to stand up against the Greeks, or against the Persians rather, and they win. The Greeks beat back the Persians at the Battle of Marathon, which is a famous battle. And in 490, they've won. And they sort of, it's like everybody looks around, they're like, whoa, like that was not what we thought was going to happen. This was sort of a doomed enterprise, a doomed venture to stand up against the great King Darius. But instead, they won. And so they know that this is not the end. And it's certainly not the end of the Persian Empire, right? We think of this as this big cataclysmic event. But in fact, for Persia, it's this minor burg, these nobodies that they're trying to defeat. But for Greece, this is huge. They've managed to stick to their guns, so to speak, and to stand by their principles, and they win. And it does get on Darius's nerves, right? There's a famous story that he had a slave remind him constantly, remember Athens, don't forget to make them pay. And so, this does, for a person like Darius who views himself as the great conqueror of the world, bringing order into chaos and winning over the world for his own kind of vision, his own world empire, it totally gets on his nerves to have been beaten by these little burgs, these kind of Greek hamlets, And so for the Greeks, this is transformative. It's a huge deal. Aeschylus was there. He fought at the Battle of Marathon, and his brother, who was a general in the Athenian army and a great war hero, his brother dies. So this is transformative and personally important for Aeschylus as well. We don't talk about this quite so much, but I mentioned when we talked about C.S. Lewis, that it matters that he was a war veteran, that he had not just stayed locked up in an ivory tower, but had seen life and knew all of the vagaries and the fear and the pain that life had to offer. And he was here sort of writing into the heart of what he had seen in the world. So he's a war veteran. He fights at Marathon. They win at Marathon. Aeschylus' brother dies, but he keeps going. And like I say, it's wild. It's crazy that they've won, and this is a big, big deal. Fast forward, Darius never gets to never conquers Greece. And his son eventually takes the throne. His son's name is Xerxes. And Xerxes, again, we'll deal with this more when we get to Herodotus, but Xerxes kind of has a little bit of waffling about whether he should try to avenge his father's failure in Greece. On the one hand, right, it's like never forget, remember Athens. And we have to make these uppity Greeks pay. And also, Xerxes is himself kind of a brat, at least according to hear the Greeks tell it. He's kind of like Darius was this great noble warlord, but Xerxes was sort of pampered. He was born into a powerful family, and he just thinks that he can conquer the world. So he has that going on as well, which makes him maybe sort of more inclined to try again, even though his father couldn't beat the Greeks. Now he's going to outshine his father. He kind of has, he waffles, he goes back and forth, he's not sure, but then finally in the end, he decides to invade Greece again. Bad move, it turns out, right? Because this is going to be the great undoing of him, at least, again, in the eyes of the Greeks. For the Persians, it's a little more complicated because they've got other fish to fry, right, besides just the Greeks. But for the Greeks, this is the big decisive moment that Xerxes sends his massive army. He will conquer the Greeks. They will not stand up against him. He will conquer Athens. He will conquer Sparta. 480. The Greeks stand up again, and they win again, right? Okay, so this, if you've seen the movie 300, which is the kind of, big Hollywood version of this is where we start with the Battle of Thermopylae, and that's the sort of tiny Spartan band led by King Leonidas, who is, they're wiped out, but they kind of hold back the line as the Persians are advancing under Xerxes. And then that sort of sets the stage for the Greeks are able to win more decisively at Salamis, which is the naval battle. And that's kind of the Athenian victory. And because it's the Athenian victory, it's what Aeschylus will focus on, because Aeschylus, again, was there. He fought also at Salamis in this second war. He was a veteran of both Greco-Persian conflicts and encounters. And, it's not quite over after Salamis. They have another battle, Plataea, and Xerxes leaves his underling, Mardonius, to kind of keep fighting on his behalf. But they win at Plataea again, and everybody, the whole Persian contingent is eventually sort of kicked out of Greece. This is a bombshell. And when you think about it, it's a bombshell still when you really look back at it, because if you had predicted what was going to happen, you would have said, well, that was the end of Greece, right? That should have been the end. And if it had been, right, there's no Young Heretics. This podcast is brought to you by the victory of the Greeks at Marathon and Salamis and the holding of the line at Thermopylae. Because if that doesn't happen, if Greece doesn't stand up against this Persian Empire, then there is no West. At least that whole half of the West is kind of gutted by this terrible calamity, which never occurs because the Greeks stand up. They stand up to the Persians and they win. If this is mind-blowing for us now, it was way more mind-blowing for them. For the Greeks, it was like, how the hell did we do that? And eventually it becomes this triumphalist narrative, right? Like, oh, we were always destined to rise, the gods favored us and all this stuff. But at first, it's not that at all. It's much more kind of, and Aeschylus bears witness to that. It's much more kind of, well, what was it? How should we understand this? And how should we take the wisdom from our victory and move forward? And again, think about how traumatic it would have been to see this empire advancing on your beloved Athens. And then how incredibly earth-shatteringly epoch-making it would be to find that you had stood by your freedom and stood up for your freedom and won, right? This is the kind of thing that shapes the mind of a generation. And it did. It was really the high classical period in many ways begins with this victory over Persia. And this Athens' sense of itself as like at the center of the world begins with them sort of saying, whoa, we have just beaten this huge army. How did we do it? What makes us different? Why did we win that fight? And after that, that's where, after that, you get sort of the great philosophy of Socrates and Plato, and you get these tragedians, Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, all of these guys, right? All of this stuff that I'm always blathering on about, right? These guys live in the shadow and in the wake of this tremendous military victory. And so that is what Persians is about. It's about why and how the Greeks were able to win. And it's about how mythologically epically wild it was that they won those battles. So there it is, right? We've won this battle. It's 472. Aeschylus is producing Persians. And Persians is, set at the Persian court. This is, again, another thing that we don't mention enough because it's so kind of second nature to us to think, we in the West, we think a lot about, what it must have been like for our enemies. But that's just crazy. He sets his great drama about Persia, not in triumphal Greece, not in Greece where everybody's happy, but in Persia to kind of get into the mind of what it must have been like to be conquered. So the plot of this play is very simple. I can go through it real quick in 3 sections. But before I do, I am going to take a break and just say thank you so much for listening. As always, it's really great to have you along for the journey. If you like what you hear and you have not yet subscribed, please do so that you can get new episodes delivered right to you. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And it's particularly helpful if you really like what you hear, if you could leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. That helps us tremendously as we are moving this podcast along. But thanks so much for being here. All right, the plot of Persians. 472, Aeschylus puts this thing on. He eventually wins the City Dionysia competition. There are 3 sections. We're in the Persian court, and we start with the old men who have been left behind because they didn't go along with Xerxes' army to fight the Greeks. So we have them left at home, and also Atossa, who is the queen mother. She was the wife of Darius. Darius is now dead. Xerxes is off fighting, and Atossa has had a bad dream. So she's kind of worried, even though everybody thought, the Persians, they're going off, they're going to win, it'll be fine, they have this big army. Atossa's worried, and so is the chorus of older men, the council of old men. So they have this kind of back and forth. They're anxious that the shadow of fate is hanging over them, but they still hope that maybe it's going to be okay. And then a messenger comes and tells them about the Battle of Salamis. So that's kind of the end of the first part, is that they learn, in fact, Xerxes has been defeated. Section 2, Atossa summons the ghost of Darius and tells him about this terrible defeat. And this is kind of a big and crazy moment, would have taken interesting stagecraft to make it work, right? That Darius comes back from the grave, this old, respected, wizened king that everybody loved. He comes back from the grave and he pronounces it with great rage on the fall of Xerxes, and his foolish son has sort of sinned away his day of grace. And so that's the middle section, the most important section. And then in the end, section 3, Xerxes comes on stage. His clothes are torn. It's this terrible symbol of abasement. He's mourning and weeping over the fact that he has lost this war. Everybody wails and mourns. And that's the end. And now this is kind of not the typical plot that you might expect from a play. Usually you think of kind of, maybe a complex series of events, and plot was important in Greek tragedy, but it wasn't the only thing. Aristotle was obsessed with plot. He was really into plot, but there was other stuff too. And a big important feature of this play, which being an earlier play, it's maybe kind of more like this. It's more ceremonial. It's kind of this deep look, it's sort of peering into the heart of this terrible event for the Persians, which, remember, for the Greeks, this was the making of them. This was the great victory that they've won. But for the Persians, it's this abject humiliation. And so it is to the same extent that it is the story of that, Persians is also the philosophical reflection upon, from the Persians' point of view, upon what has gone wrong. And the series of answers that Aeschylus develops to those questions are very profound. It's a deep set of answers. So let's just go through kind of some of the major answers to the question, why did the Greeks win? It's not this kind of jingoistic celebration of it that you might think it would be. So we begin, as I said, in the Persian court. And even though we've sent this big army off, we have this inclination that maybe something has gone wrong. And here's what the chorus says. Now, I'm reading here, if you can see me, I'm holding it up, but I'm reading here from Edith Hall's translation, which is put up by Arison Phillips. It's not the translation that I recommend you go out and buy. If you want to read this in English, go buy Seth Benedetti's Chicago University Press version. It's just put out again, reprinted in 2013. I'm reading this one because it's got the Greek and the English sort of side by side, so that's helpful and nice. But if you're going to read it in English, I would recommend that Chicago University Press version. But here's Hall's translation is also quite good. And here's what the chorus says early on. It's around line 86. They say, "No one is so renowned for valor that they can withstand such a huge flood of men and ward them off with sturdy defenses. A sea wave is invincible. The Persians' army is irresistible, and its people are brave of heart. So this is their confidence, that they have enough men and enough strength to wipe out these little puny Greeks. But, and this is the next stanza, because this is a choral song, right? But what mortal man can avoid being cunningly deceived by God? Who is so swift-footed that he has the power to leap easily aside? With apparent friendliness at first, Calamity fawns on a man and induces him into her nets. It is impossible for a mortal to escape from them and flee. And so this is the first kind of inkling that things may be going terribly wrong. And it's part of an important Greek concept, which is the concept of hubris, another major word in Aristotle's theory of tragedy, but also more generally, it's sort of something that obsesses the Greeks. Is this notion that you become victorious, and in your victory you become proud, and in your pride you become vulnerable. That your cockiness and your complacency kind of leads you astray. And so the Greeks, there are these little city-states that are having to, fight for their lives. That makes them strong. And the Persians have already had to fight for their supremacy, and now they're complacent because they have all this power. Xerxes was born into power and into tremendous wealth, and he thinks he can just go off like a sea wave, like a crashing wave, and destroy them. Notice there's no talk about the greatness of the Persians' system here. It's very subtle on Aeschylus' part that they're not confident that their way of doing things is better. They're just confident that they're big and they're going to take these guys out. And so that's the first inclination, that the chorus is uneasy because they have this sense that fate comes for us if we allow ourselves to become complacent. And Atossa, the queen, comes on stage. She's got basically the same worry. So she says, "Anxiety is tearing my heart also. I did not invent the proverb I am about to tell you, friends." She's talking to the chorus here. "I am afraid that great wealth may kick up a cloud of dust from the ground and overturn the prosperity which Darius won by divine favor. The trouble in my heart, of which I can hardly speak, is twofold. I believe that the masses would not hold in respect wealth in the absence of men, and light would not shine as radiantly on indigent people as on the powerful. I believe," I'm going to read this again, "I believe that the masses would not hold in respect wealth in the absence of men." There it is, right? It's this worry that all of the wealth in the world is no substitute for courage, for manly courage on the part of the military. And this idea of virtue and valor is the first thing that you sort of think civilizations, as they grow great, they kind of lose this. The modern version of this that you may have heard, right, is hard times make tough men make good times make soft men make bad times. And that is the cycle, right? This is in ancient terms, this is a much more sort of profound thing than I've maybe made it out to be by quoting that little tag, right? This is called the cycle of regimes, or anacyclosis. And we're gonna get into this theory a little bit more deeply later on, but that's kind of the shadow hanging over the opening of this play. And notice again, it is not even yet about, Persians are like this and Greeks are like this. It's just humans, when they get too wealthy and too powerful, they lose sight of what matters. They lose sight of the things that have made them great in the first place, and they get complacent. Now, this is something that people are thinking about a lot these days. As I record, there is this terrible civil unrest roiling America, and a lot of us are kind of looking out and thinking, oh gosh, is this our own sort of downfall, that we have become so wealthy, so powerful, so free, so successful that we don't even know what it was that made us that way, right? We're tearing down, we're defacing statues of Churchill because we don't understand that this Western tradition is what we owe our freedom to. So there's great wisdom in this, even though it produces a tremendous amount of anxiety in us right now, I would imagine. So then the hammer drops, right? Then the messenger comes on and reveals, yes, in fact, Xerxes has lost at the Battle of Salamis. And so this is the great, really the turning point of the play. And we have to kind of go back to raise the ghost of Darius. And that's what Atossa then does. She performs this ritual, and the ghost of her dead husband kind of towers over the play, which is, again, artistically a very sophisticated move on Aeschylus' part. He sort of sees the memory of this great king as hovering over this tragedy, that Xerxes has fallen, and now Darius, who was, the wise and just and powerful ruler, is here to kind of explicate what's gone wrong. And here's what he says. This, to me, is probably the best monologue in the play, and I'm going to read the whole thing because it is so profound, and there's lots to talk about in it. So I will pull it up here. Darius, around line 739, says, "Alas, how swiftly oracles have been accomplished. Zeus has hurled down on my son the consummation of prophecies. I trusted, I suppose, that the gods would bring them to fulfillment in some far distant time. But when someone is himself hasty, God lends assistance too. Now it seems that a fountain spring of misery has been discovered for all those dear to me, and this was achieved by my son, uncomprehending in his youthful audacity, the man who thought he could constrain with fetters like a slave the sacred flowing Hellespont." This is the body of water, this sort of small body of water in between Asia Minor and Europe. The sacred flowing Hellespont, the divine stream of the Bosporus. He altered the very nature of the strait, and by casting around it hammered shackles, furnished a great road for his great army. Although only a mortal, he foolishly thought he could overcome all the gods, including Poseidon. Surely this must have been some disease affecting my son's mind. I am afraid that the great wealth I amassed by my labors may be plundered by the first comer. It's a great speech. Really just so rich. There's so much in it. Two ideas that I want to draw from it. One is this thing that would eventually, again, go on to become a major theme of Greek philosophy. And it had already been under discussion before Aeschylus wrote this play, but he kind of captures it in artistic form, this back and forth between individual action and historical determinism, the kind of wheels of history turning. And this is this idea that, yes, there are cycles of regimes. Things do tend to go in a certain way. Nothing lasts forever. Even great empires fall. All of that is tremendously at play here. It's a big part of what's going on. But Darius says there is also an element of individual choice here. By being foolish, by being impetuous, my son hastened the demise, even if it was fated, even if eventually all empires fall. My son has brought it on with his own kind of headlong rush into destruction. Very wise and sophisticated way of looking at all of this. Again, there's a lot in this for us now that we look out at the world and we think, well, are we just powerless? Is the world just kind of crashing around us? And this is the end of the American regime. I've been hearing a tremendous amount of despair. And for me, it's like there is something to the idea that regimes just rise and fall. But there's also something to the idea that, you, even though you have no control over that, you do have control over the one thing that you're going to get up and do today, right? That's what one of the things this play has for you is that you can wake up and make a choice, and your choice will matter. It will matter whether you stand for the good and the true and the beautiful and for freedom, or whether you don't. Even if it's a doomed fight, you can stave off disaster one more day, or you can be like Xerxes, right, and destroy everything. That's your other option. And so this is, I think, again, tremendously sophisticated. It also contains within it the seeds of what will become one of the great Greek contributions to political philosophy. And that is, I mentioned it already, the doctrine of anacyclosis, or the notion of the cycle of regimes. Now, this is not fully developed at this point in this play, but the idea of it is hovering over, and that mechanism of hubris, that you get super powerful and then you kind of forget what made you great and you fall. That mechanism is going to drive a very intricate sort of idea in the Greek mind of the interplay between regimes. Now, you get this in Plato's Republic and in Aristotle's Politics, this kind of this system of different ways of running a government. You can have monarchy, you can have aristocracy, and you can have democracy. And all of those have good versions, right? You can have a good king, you can have a good aristocracy of virtuous leaders, and you can have, a well-run democracy that abides by the rule of law. But Aristotle saw, and eventually, Polybius, the later historian, would really develop this out, that, if you get to a monarch, let's say you start in kind of what you would call now a state of nature, with everybody just doing everything he wants. And then somebody takes control. Some virtuous man says, I'm going to lead us now. That's monarchy, right? That's the king. But then, his son, this is Darius and Xerxes, right? Darius is great, but then Xerxes, his son, is kind of complacent and prideful and all of that. And that's tyranny. That's the decay of monarchy into kind of lawless tyranny. And once tyranny decays far enough, then we kind of see aristocracies coming back. And you know, there's a few men kind of stage a coup and take over to lead justly and rightly. But that kind of devolves into cronyism, and, you know, people eventually just give favors to one another, not based on their virtue, but on the basis just of their friendships, basically. That's oligarchy, right? That's the kind of decayed version of aristocracy. Then the people, right, take control. They kind of wrest control back from the oligarchy, and they institute a democracy. But when democracy becomes lawless, then it's just mob rule. And then you start back up again, right? Because the mob rule, some strong man comes up and takes control. There is so much wisdom here. You can watch what's happening right now in Seattle, which is this kind of, you know, demilitarized, supposedly demilitarized free zone, the autonomous area. And there's already a warlord coming back because this is how it works, right? Mob rule deteriorates into monarchy and then into tyranny, and all, you know, these things are real. They're real features of the universe, and we've lost them because we've just sort of forgot about any of this stuff. And this is, you know, tremendously important. This anacyclosis cycle of regimes. It's one of the great things that Aeschylus has to offer in Persians, and that the Greeks have to offer. And interestingly, fascinatingly, that it is shared. I think some part of this sentiment is shared also by Jerusalem. I was thinking as I worked on this episode of Psalm 30, which says, "In a time of prosperity, I said, I shall never be shaken." We've all felt this before, right? We've all felt this sense that, you know, God has kind of given me this great success and it's never going to end. I'm just going to be fine forever. And that's hubris. That's this idea that you kind of, you know, you just feel like you're on top of the world and it's never going to end. And that's the moment that fate comes for you, right? And you fall. And that's what happens to Xerxes in this play. It's an insight that is shared by Jerusalem. And I think it's one of the reasons why, as the West takes shape, it holds on to this tradition of thinking about the downfall of its enemies with an empathetic mind. And that, again, the accusation, this is, in fact, the one of the first major accusations in our modern era against the West was made by a man named Edward Said, who wrote a book called Orientalism. And in Orientalism, the first example is Aeschylus, Persians. And Said says, look, Persians is just kind of a, you know, it's just a jingoistic way of kind of stereotyping everybody Eastern. And the West has just been doing that nonstop for all of its history, just saying that that the East is effeminate and luxurious and decadent, and aren't the Greeks great that they won? And Edith Hall, you know, one of the reasons I don't recommend her edition entirely is she is a disciple of this idea called Orientalism, right? That from Aeschylus onward, the West has this, she calls it a dangerous habit of denigrating its enemies along racial lines, along, you know, misogynist lines, all of this stuff. To me, this could not be a more backwards and wrong reading of Aeschylus and of the Greek tradition. The point of Persians is exactly not that the Persians are somehow inherently wrong, inherently effeminate, inherently weak. The point is that they have reached a stage in their advanced culture that Greece may one day reach too. The cycle of regimes comes for us all. And the reason why places like Athens and Jerusalem are so interested in thinking about downfall and sympathizing with the downtrodden is because they know that we all may get there eventually. And Aeschylus is no dummy about this, right? He's not just talking about, the hubris of Persia. He's talking about hubris, full stop, the human condition, not the Persian condition. He's talking about this may happen to us too. And of course, in fact, it did, right? Athens did become proud and overweening and did eventually overreach. We'll talk about the Peloponnesian War later on and how Athens kind of goes to its downfall. But this is about the human condition. And this is, again, it is one of the great triumphs of the West that we do this. Nobody else does this. And yeah, it does involve looking at other cultures and saying they're different from us, but they are different. Persia did do things differently, and they did things differently in their own estimation. You can see the record of this. You can go to places like Behistun or Bisotin. There's this location where Darius left behind a massive inscription and had made this set of reliefs and inscriptions telling of his conquests over the world. And it's like, yeah, I have a special connection to heaven. Heaven has granted me dominion over these lesser men, and they're all portrayed as these little midgets, and he towers over them. I mean, this was the vision of the world that Persia reached, was of this kind of one autocratic man. And over and against that, we get this in Herodotus too, over and against that, we are told that the Greeks loved freedom and the law. And that's not about it's not about their race. It's not about who they were. It's about what they believed. You get this also from Demaratus, who's a sort of exiled Spartan king, says this to Xerxes, like the Greeks will fight you to the last man. They will not stop resisting because of their freedom, because they believe in their laws and their freedom. And it's not evil to say that that is a different way of doing things and a way of doing things that bears holding on to, because once you lose it, you do become like Persia. You do become decadent and overweening and too powerful for your own good. So that's the warning in this play. And no other civilization does this. You don't see the Persians going out and doing this, thinking, gosh, what was it? What must it have been like for these conquered people that we have subjugated to be conquered? What led to that? How might we avoid that? Are we subject to it? This is a fundamentally Western act. It's even in the Iliad. We went, if you go back to our episode in the Iliad, you'll notice Hector, who is the Trojan, who is the enemy of the Greeks, is the noblest person in the poem. Why? Because the West is all about understanding that in humility, understanding that even the people you conquer, are noble and you could meet the same fate as them. Tremendously transformative, unique, important, not something to be ashamed of, not something to, label as Orientalism or what have you. It's actually one of the greatest things of the West. And we try to, the enemies of the West try to make this into something that we should be ashamed of. It's the opposite. We should be proud of this. It's important. And it's important that we keep doing it, right? That we keep understanding that, pride comes for us all. All right. That is what I have to say to you about Aeschylus' Persians for now, just on anacyclosis and pride and empathy for the downtrodden. We're going to come back again and again to Persians, because we could do a whole other episode just on another theme, and we will. But that's going to be Persians for now. Let us do the mailbag. You guys have been asking great questions, and this has been really fun. A fun part of this whole thing is answering all your questions. After the Symposium episode, after we talked about Plato and Socrates in the Symposium, I got one question a bunch of times. A bunch of people asked me, was Socrates real? How much of this is real? How much of it is true? How much did Plato just kind of put his own views into the mouth of this character named Socrates? What do we know about the real, actual Socrates? An excellent question, and it's not one that I'm going to resolve here and now. It's sort of like the authorship question with Homer or with Isaiah. I will give you my take on this issue, and then you should go away and study it more, because people have wondered this basically since Plato wrote. How much of this is a real depiction of Socrates? Now, here are some things that we know to be true. There was a person named Socrates, and he was a philosopher. He lived during the 5th century BC in Athens, and in some way, it seems almost certain that he stood out among the crowd of philosophers. We also know there was a lot of natural philosophy, a lot of rhetorical theory, a lot of metaphysics going on in Athens during this time, and it seems as if Socrates stood out especially. We know he was killed. We know he was executed by the Athenian people for corrupting the youth and for defaming the gods, or leading the youth to not believe in the gods. Beyond that, we are a little bit in the dark. We, as I mentioned on the Symposium episode, Socrates never wrote anything down. So there's a lot that we don't know. Now, who else never wrote anything down that we know of is Jesus, right? Except for that one moment in John when he scribbles in the sand, in the dirt. But so we think that we can know a fair amount about Jesus from the accounts of his followers. And that is basically kind of what I think about Socrates. I am less on the skeptical side than some people. Some people think that Plato basically just makes up Socrates as a creation of his own imagination, as a device in basically his putting forth his own philosophical theory. One thing that I think is plausible is that as Plato grew older and as his career went on, he started to sort of go out on his own a little bit more, go off on his own tangents. And since Socrates was always an important character in his dialogues, I think probably the older Plato got, he may have put more and more of his own ideas into Socrates. And we do know, we don't just have Plato's accounts of Socrates. Xenophon's another writer who wrote accounts of Socrates. So we know that different people had different views of him, and that it's not just, a faithful, you can't just be sure that Plato provides a faithful account. It's nothing like that. But here's why I don't think it's a good idea to go about kind of trying to sift through what is Socrates' view and what is Plato's view. Because first of all, you'll never do it. It's always just speculation. But more importantly, Plato is at least deeply enamored of who Socrates was and what he meant. And we talked when we did the symposium about how incredibly important memory was for Plato, even the way that memory distorts things and the way that things take on a different character in your memory than maybe they had in the actual moment you were experiencing them. That reveals to you something true about how Socrates, in this case, affected you. And so Plato is preserving some part of what his relationship with Socrates was like. And that's what we have. And this is actually, I have several friends. My father is one of them, but I have a number of close, intimate friendships that are so intellectually productive that we can't even tell whose ideas are whose anymore. We kind of get to the end of a conversation and think, I can't remember if you first thought of this or if I first thought of this. Hopefully you have some of these friendships too. I think that Plato's relationship with Socrates was like that. It was so intimate and so intellectually fertile that Plato himself probably didn't totally know kind of what came from Socrates and what came from him. And I believe that the development that Plato offers of ideas that he learned from Socrates in the dialogues, that development is an organic and real and honest and true development of Socratic thought, even if we can't be totally sure what Socrates said and what Plato said and all that. I think that there's something important about preserving this kind of mix between Plato's experience of Socrates and actual Socrates himself. That's my take. It's kind of a different take. I don't think you're going to hear that take in a lot of other places. And that's my answer to your question. Was Socrates a real person? Yes, he was real. No, we don't totally know exactly what he said and what Plato said. No, I don't think in the end it really matters. That's the end of this episode of Young Heretics. It has been such a joy to have you with us. If you enjoy this podcast, you will almost certainly love the work of the Claremont Institute, where I am employed. It is a fantastic place dedicated to the recovery of the American idea. Now is a great time to be reading about that. We have two publications, the Claremont Review of Books and The American Mind, and we always welcome donations, as people have been asking whether they can donate. Yes, you certainly can. Go to claremont.org/donate, or just go to our main website and hit the donate button at the top right. And do tell them that we sent you. Tell them that you came from Young Heretics. All right. Thanks again for listening. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.